former Loyola alum. And so welcome back, and please do a presentation. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. As Kevin mentioned, my name is Ed Seyler. I graduated from Loyola in 2012. Seems like it's pretty recently, but this classroom, used to be like a mock trial room. There was like a jury box over there, so it feels a little different. As you mentioned, I graduated from Loyola with a BBA. Just a brief biographical note, I also got a master's from LSU in economics after I graduated. While I was there, I got an internship working for the state, for the Legislative Auditor's Office in the Performance Audit Services section. If you're familiar with the Legislative Auditor, we have, I still work there now, we have a bunch of different sections. What we think of is probably more of the financial statement auditing, where they look at the state's CAFR, the annual financial report, make sure that it's accurate, it's presented fairly. That's probably our largest section. My section looks at different state government programs, and under certain limited circumstances, even local government programs, to see if they are fulfilling their objectives, if they're economical, efficient, and effective. And so I actually still work there now. I'm an economist there now, and I've had the opportunity since I've been there to work on my PhD in economics at LSU. So it's a really great place. I think definitely economics is a good major to choose. Definitely gives you a lot of useful skills in the job market. And I definitely would say Loyola, got a really good start in it. And it's been a really good foundation. So just something to think about. So as you mentioned, I'm going to present on, this is my, one of the chapters. It's a work in progress. So, anything is subject to change based on, my continuing work on it. But it looks at, it's a question of land. How do you define what's a land parcel? And does the way that these land parcels were initially defined 200 years ago have continuing effects today? There are different ways of defining boundaries, and I'll talk about what some of those are in the course of this presentation. And there are trade-offs between the different systems. Each one works a little bit differently. Some of them are more flexible than others. Others are more regular. They're more rectangular, more rigid. And there's a trade-off because some of them, there's really no upfront cost. People just can, one of them, the simplest, the meets and bounds system, people can just define their land however they want. It's very decentralized. And the other choice is, on the other extreme, is the rectangular system, where the government sends surveyors to go out and survey rectangles throughout the whole country. They actually have done this already. And there was an upfront cost for that. So previous research has kind of studied that contrast and found that there are long-term consequences from which one you choose. The reason for these long-term consequences is related to a very important economics concept called the coast theory, which I'll talk about in a subsequent slide. The basic idea of the coast theorem is that the way that property rights are initially defined can have a long-term effect on efficiency if there are obstacles for people to transact, that is to say, transactions costs. Louisiana is, you might wonder, well, if it's already been done, why do we need to do it again? Well, Louisiana is an interesting case. We have a different system that doesn't exist anywhere else in the United States. It's called the Armpit System. And we also have very unique terrain. We have a lot of wetlands. And so this provides a unique opportunity to study the coast theorem in the real world. And so this also is relevant in the future. You might think, oh, well, all the land's already there. I mean, what's there more to allocate? Why do we need to study this? Well, there's always new types of property rights that are being established in areas like wireless spectrum markets. You could argue even that patents are a kind of property right. They're a little bit different. It's not as geographic, but it certainly can be conceptualized along the same way. And so this kind of analysis is useful in studying how partitioning or allocating a new resource should be done to maximize its productive value. So I don't know if everyone here has had intermediate micro or has come across the coast theorem, but just for those who maybe aren't as familiar with it, just a brief introduction. to it, this is a really important theorem in economics. So Guy Coase, who came up with it, won the Nobel Prize for it, so it's very important. It concerns instances where property rights are in dispute. And I think it's a lot easier to conceptualize in an actual situation before trying to understand it in abstract. So the example that Coase gave was this, it was an actual lawsuit, Sturgis versus Bridgman. It was in 1879, and it concerned a situation where you had a doctor who was right next door to a confectioner, or someone who makes sweets. And the problem was the doctor is trying to do work that involves listening to people's heartbeats and thinking abstractly, and the noise from the mortars and pestles at the confectionery shop was distracting him. And so he went to court and sued and said, you can't do this. This is interfering with my activities. It's costing me money. And the general concept here that is in play is something called an externality. And that is it's a consequence of an action. It can be positive or negative. In this case, it's noise. It's negative. And it's something it's a cost or a benefit that's borne by someone who's not a party to the activity that causes the externality. So in this case, you can imagine the noise is the externality. The doctor isn't choosing to make the noise. He's not choosing to make sweets. And so he's bearing the cost, but he is not also bearing the benefit. And externalities are a big deal in economics because ordinarily people are rational. They would look at the benefits and costs of an activity, and they wouldn't do it unless the benefits exceed the costs. However, if there are external costs that are not borne by the person who's choosing whether to engage in that activity, then the social costs could exceed the benefits that are being realized by that person. And so the person's doing something that would be arguably a net drain on society. The same could be true if there were benefits, positive externalities that the person isn't taking into account. In that case, then a person might not engage in a socially useful activity because he's not able to capture all the benefits of it. And so before Coase came along, they had, the idea was based on, obviously, of justice in the courts. They ruled in favor of the doctor. The confectioner said, well, I've been doing this for 25 years with the same equipment in the same place. He just came to the news, and so he really was free to, locate that somewhere else. He actually chose to do it. It's actually a very clever argument for trying to say it's not really an externality. The doctor chose to participate in it by choosing to locate there. But the courts didn't buy that, and they said that the confectioner was using the property in a way that was not in character with the local area, which wouldn't permit this kind of noise and this kind of vibration. So the doctor won. The confectioner presumably had to quiet his stuff down. And the way that economists approached this prior to Coase was with this Pigovian idea, or Pigu was his name. And this is just a side note. I mean, this is what Coase was really arguing against. He said that the confectioner should have to pay a fee to the doctor, basically, to internalize the cost. In other words, the cost that is being borne by the doctor should be somehow quantified. The noise should be quantified into a dollar amount. And then the confectioner pays that to the other party. And then that discourages the confectioner from doing something that would be socially harmful. And it also compensates the doctor for his suffering of having to listen to this noise. And the idea that Coase had was that if the doctor and the confectioner are free to bargain, they could actually reach an efficient outcome regardless of how the court decides. And he also was pointing out that that there are a lot of problems with Pigu's approach because it's kind of one size fits all. It just says, well, we'll just discourage a harmful activity, and that's how we're going to prevent this from happening. The intuition behind Coase's idea is that regardless of how the court decides, the parties, if they can get together, will reach an efficient outcome. I made a little table here that kind of explains it. I actually found it later. It's funny, I think I must have, this is like the subconscious copyright infringement. I looked in the Landsberg textbook that I had, and this is exactly the same table that's in there. So the idea is if it costs more for the doctor to move, then the doctor should stay where he is and the confectioner can move. And so even if the doctor wins, then the confectioner just moves. If the confectioner wins, if the two parties can get together, the doctor can pay for the confectioner to move. Because it costs more for him to do so. In other words, if the confectioner stuff costs $300 to move, the doctor would have to pay $1,000 to move. Then if they can get together and say, how much is it going to cost you? How much is it going to cost me? Okay, let's work this deal out. They could work it out that way. And you can see the converse would be true for the confection. So the reason we're going through this whole exercise is just to say that the genius of this approach is that if the parties can come together, they may be able to devise unique solutions to their specific situation that are more tailored than what a court could do or what you could do with a legislatively enacted tax or subsidy. For example, the PGU subsidy would not account for the possibility, for example, installing soundproofing. I mean, if the confectioner is paying the doctor could choose to do that with his money, but it wouldn't necessarily be something that could be anticipated from a 35,000 foot view. The problem fundamentally with the Piguvian approach is that all you can do is discourage someone from creating an externality. And that's not necessarily the same as devising a solution that's unique to that circumstance that would satisfy both parties' needs. So where this comes in with land is the ultimate in unique situation and how it's located. What realtors always say is location, location, location. And it really is very hard to devise one grid that would work for a very large area, unless it's the Great Plains of the United States where it does work pretty well. The issue with land is that if you have a particular parcel of land and you don't like the shape of it, it can be very hard to make it into the desirable shape. If you want, for example, if your land is a triangle and you want to make it into a square, well, you can draw a dotted line of where the square would be and see that it depends on if the person who owns that land is willing to give it up and would be satisfied with the resulting shape of their land. In fact, one of the things I'll give a little shout out to is Javier Portillo, who's a classmate of mine here at Loyola a few years ago. He got his PhD, and his dissertation was actually on a similar subject on the high transactions costs that exist in land markets. And the problems with having, your neighbor may not be willing to sell. That's essentially the problem with land markets. And the issue, you might wonder, how is there an externality here? There's not some noise being generated necessarily. The issue is that land may need to be in a particular shape in order to be useful. For a farm, for example, you wouldn't want something that's really long that is hard to irrigate. It might be more useful to have something that's a circular shape. For example, if you fly over the west, you see all the circular patches of land where someone's irrigating it. In order to agglomerate that land, there would be benefits that you would have from owning a roughly circular or square shape of land that wouldn't be realized by the people who are selling it or who would have to sell it to you to create that parcel. Let me go ahead and skip to the picture. I think this makes a good example. One of the problems you can wind up with land claims is the way that land was originally settled in the eastern United States was this meets and bounds system. And so imagine if someone on the left just came along and claimed that kind of, somewhat reasonably shaped piece of land and the piece on the right, and maybe they said, I'm just going to go from, the tree that's at one corner to this rock to this stream, and it made something that seemed reasonable, but then someone else came along next to him and claimed another seemingly reasonably shaped piece of land, but they wind up with that blue unclaimed portion in the middle. That's not very useful by itself, and it may be that it's too much land for the person on the left, it's too much land for the person on the right. Neither of them can really add it to their farm, and so because of the kind of helter-skelter way that they initially allocated the land, they haven't maximized the value of the land. Another problem, I mean, this I just find mind-boggling to imagine. I mean, initially they allocated the land along these red lines, and you can see the blue lines that are kind of in the middle that would make slightly larger squares. Imagine if the blue is the ideal size for a farm, based on how long it takes you to till a field in a particular day, or how much you can effectively manage by yourself. If you were trying to go from the red grid to the blue grid, and you own just one of those red squares, that would be really hard to do. You'd have to find someone with a blue square who'd be willing to sell you just a little piece. And so it creates a lot of challenges. There's a lot of transactions that you would have to do to resize the grid from one to another. And there would be a lot of people who'd have to agree. They probably would not agree. One of the other problems that you can run into is if, suppose that two developers start developing properties and they start with grids and they collide. This looks, I think, actually a lot like New Orleans city streets. You can wind up with these weird little triangles of land that nobody really wants. So you can build, you can build a little building there, but it still is probably not the optimal shape. And the problem was that there wasn't coordination between the parties when they were initially setting up their grids. And so these are the problems, just to wrap up what we're saying, these are the problems that you can wind up with in land markets that create difficulties for the parties to come together and form optimally shaped parcels. So it's very important how you initially allocate the parcels. So just to describe the situation specifically in Louisiana, Louisiana is different from other states in that most states, they were either colonial states, like the original 13, parts of Mississippi and Alabama also use this. It's called the meets and bounds system. We have some land that follows the meets and bounds system, as you can see right here in the Florida parishes, kind of towards, I think this is being like the, I don't know if it's the inside of the blue, whatever you want to call this, West Feliciana Parish, East Feliciana Parish, this area. English settlers actually came there before Louisiana was part of the United States, and so they used the English meets and bounds system. Now the French settled the areas that are here in black. The French brought with them a system called the Artment System, which involves long lots that are, each one, I'll show you a picture in just a minute. Each one of them has river access, and then they extend back a long ways from the river. The idea is to prioritize river access. And it's a somewhat rectangular system, but it's not as rectangular as the rest of the state, which is under the Public Land Survey System. You may remember the Northwest Ordinance of 1785. That was an act of Congress, actually the pre-Constitution Congress of the Confederation created that. And it's a grid. Most of the United States that joined, since the original 13 is under that grid system. However, Congress actually, specifically in the case of Louisiana, recognized that it was going to be very expensive to survey all those marshes. And just to give you an idea of why it's so expensive, each one of those grid squares, those are actually township range squares. The way it works is there's sections, townships, and ranges. And then each one of them refers to a little square. I can show you a picture in a subsequent slide. And the idea is that that's a unique address. And if you say section 36 township 10 north, range east 8 west, then that's a specific location that anyone can find. And they put markers at the corners of each of those sections. And so if you go there, I haven't actually seen one, but there are purportedly landmarks that show you where those are. And someone had to go out there, I don't know when exactly, even hundreds of years ago, and put them there. So if it's the marsh, no one's going to want that land. They didn't want to waste time surveying that land that people probably weren't going to want. And so Congress authorized the surveyors to continue using the Armpit system that was already in place. So there's already been some prior research on this. There's one other state at least that has both systems, specifically Ohio. Liebecap and Luke looked at the Virginia Military District, which is Cincinnati, I think, is in it. It's kind of like the southern central portion of Ohio. And it's a small area that was allocated to Revolutionary War veterans. And it was allocated before the public land survey system was authorized. And so those areas use the meets and bounds system. The rest of the United States, like I said, including the rest of Ohio is actually the first state to use the public land survey system. And Ohio was the first state to use the public land survey system. And what they found was that the rectangular system created more predictable property rights. They found that those areas had higher values, and there were less legal disputes between the people who own those parties on a percentage basis. However, they did find that in areas with more rugged terrain, that premium disappears. In other words, if you just say from Washington, D.C., okay, there's going to be a grid covering the whole country, without regard to the features in that specific area, you could wind up with a particular square that has a cliff running through it, and that's not going to be tremendously useful. And so what would be more efficient would be to have one that's on one side of the cliff and the other on the other side of the cliff, and that way you don't have to drive your tractor across them to farm your one plot of land. There's also another paper that looked at Georgia. Georgia had a land lottery system, and they distributed land. The problem was that the land sizes were not necessarily the optimal sizes for each parcel. And what they found was they actually looked at historical sales, and they found that over time you could see the distinctive characteristics of parcels in each of those areas fading, but it still was there 80 years later. After 150 years, they said that it had faded away. But the point of this is to say that there are transactions costs in land markets, and previous research has found that can prevent people from using Gaussian bargaining to reshape land into the ideal shape. So I'll talk for a minute about what the systems are in Louisiana. The first system that we have, as I mentioned, is the meets and bounds system. This is the English system. It's very helter-skelter. You can just basically say, this is a real legal description I got from the West Louisiana Parish Assessor's website just for one land parcel. You can see this isn't even a very rural lot. This is like one in town. And there's a pipe and a fence post somewhere. So you basically have to do like a scavenger hunt to find where the property actually ends. And you can see it's not very costly for the government, because all they have to do is just stamp the deeds when they come in and approve it. But it requires more cost for the person who wants to buy the land, because they have to actually go survey where each of those things are going to be put. Each of the landmarks are going to be put. And this is one of the things, as I mentioned, Liebecap and Luke showed that the meets and bounds system does not provide a lot of certainty. That pipe is just a pipe that's sitting there, and you could move it if you want a little bit more land. You shouldn't, it's illegal, but it can be done without detection, or it'd be very hard to detect. So just to show you what does that look like, this is some real land from West Louisiana Parish. This is, as you can see, there's just totally irregular shapes. Now, West Louisiana Parish, if you've been there, they've got like rivers and different things there, so that's probably what, I don't think that someone, really just meandered like that through there, but as you can see, there are some of these parcels have, very, very weird shapes. There's like, one guy just wanted this little square, so someone else owns this one. So it can be kind of weird. So Congress was aware of the situation in 1785. That is why they created the public land survey system. And so the idea, as I mentioned, it's a grid. Each one of those sections is 1 square mile. And there's a number, so it's very easy to know exactly what section you're talking about. And then even within that section, 1 square mile is 640 acres. That's more than probably one person wanted back then. And so they have what are called aliquot parts. And this is actually, if you look at the assessor's office in, say, Caddo Parish, you'll find a lot of land parcels that are defined as the Northwest Quad. They'll actually do NW/4. of Section 26, Township 19 North, Range 11 West. That tells you exactly what you have. And you can see, I mean, compare that to this meets and bounds example. It's a lot less text, and it's a lot less open to interpretation as to which pile of stones you're talking about. And so to show you what this looks like, this is a different parish in North Louisiana. This is Lincoln Parish. Very, very plain vanilla, very rectangular. That is what all of Lincoln Parish looks like. In fact, if you look at Google Maps in most of the central United States, and if you just look, you'll see the farm boundaries are, oftentimes either 1 mile, 1 square mile, or half a mile by a quarter mile. They use these lines, and this really affects the landscape. This is an example of an actual, parcel map. I think this is what they call Tobin maps. That someone in the 1950s went and drew this. So these are people's farms, and I mean they make ample use of the fact that they don't need to come up with their own tree or something to define their property they use the section lines. And so the last system, this is the Louisiana special system. This is the Artment System. And Arpent is just from the French word to survey. An arpenteur, I think, is a surveyor. And the idea is that there are rivers. You want to be next to a river so you can irrigate your land and also have transportation access. And so they made tracks that were 5 arpents wide and went 40 arpents inland, or maybe a vague distance inland. It just depends. But in general, that's kind of the standard system. And an arpent, just for reference, is about 192 feet. A square arpent is just 192 feet by 192 feet, so whatever that number is squared. If you go to Canada, actually in Quebec, they have the same system there. And it's a French system. And so when the United States took over former colonies, in a lot of cases, if there were existing land grants that had been given by European governments, they recognized those. And Louisiana was no different in that regard. And as I mentioned, I mean, Congress, so much so that Congress actually continued to just use this system. They had this grand design to survey the whole U.S. with a rectangular grid, but they allowed Louisiana to continue using the system that was already in place. So this is an example. This is a map of Point P Parish. It's just northwest of Baton Rouge. This is the False River area, and this shows you what the Arpent system looks like. The little black lines are actually individual parcels. And you can see there are a lot of little tiny, long, skinny farms along that. It's called the Oxbow Lake, I think is what that's called. It used to be the Mississippi River. The river then turned. It actually goes a different direction now. But people had already put their farms there. So it's a very popular recreational destination. Some of you may have been. I went there to the clerk of court's office, which is not as recreational, but it is. You see the Arpents. I mean, it's right there. And one of the things that's interesting about this is that you can see in some cases, I think I may need to go over to the mouse. It may be kind of blurry, but you can see in some cases this is actually a situation where people owned these little parcels here. They actually continued the Arpent system even into the neighboring rectangular section. And so that brings us to one of the important points about this is that actually I think I zoomed in on the next one. Yeah, that makes it a little bit clearer. And you can see just people continue their plots because they want to have a continuous plot of land. And so it just goes to show that whatever is the initial system that you use, people can still deviate from that system. In other words, if you've done the rectangular survey, you could still make Arpent lots from it if you can get that land. And likewise, if it's a meets and bounds system, you can try to force it into rectangular shapes. Once again, if someone's willing to sell to you, which there may be high transaction costs that prevent that. And so you can see, in fact, here's another situation. This map on the right is actually, you can get this from the Department of Natural Resources Sunrise system. It's a very useful, it's just on the internet. And it shows you the original, PLSS map. So this is from I don't know when it was drawn, probably the first decades of the 19th century. You can see that basically this. You see that those effects cease to be significant when we get to, by the time we get to column 7. So what that tells us is that it's kind of like what the whole reason Congress authorized the Artment System was. They knew that system, they knew that certain lands were more valuable. They wanted those to be settled first, the areas along the river. Particularly the wetland areas, you can't really farm in a marsh. And so those areas are disproportionately likely to be surveyed using the rectangular system because they were the last ones that were surveyed. And so it kind of shows the importance of controls, before you simply look at, just the kind of raw means for the value of Armpit lands, rectangular lands, and just make a conclusion based on that. And so I did a little subgroup analysis as well. One of the issues is, there's a lot of urban parcels. Urban parcels are typically platted, they have subdivisions, and so the original system doesn't really matter. There's a map that's filed with the parish or with the county that shows the system that's in use there, or it shows exactly where each lot is located. And that becomes the legal description of the parcel. You'll notice in the city, you can just say, oh, I have lot 23 in the Carrollton subdivision or something like that. And so you can see that for non-urban parcels, both the Armpit indicator and the rectangular system indicator cease to be significant. And when we look at that excluding wetlands as well, then once again the coefficients are insignificant. And so the kind of interpretation I have for this is that this contrasts with what Liebecap and Luke found in 2011, because they were looking at Ohio. Ohio is particularly has less wetlands as far as I'm aware. They did find that there was no difference in rugged terrain, though. And so that's actually consistent with what we're seeing. You could argue that Louisiana has much more marsh, it has much more variation. And so in that situation, a more adaptable system is actually not going to perform worse than a more regularized system. And like I said, it's consistent with the fact that Congress kind of knew about this in 1811. That's why they did it the way they did. And so it could mean either that particular system was optimal to begin with, or that the rugged terrain means that there's not as much of a premium for one system versus the other. There's trade-offs to each system, and on average they average out, and there's really not a big difference between the systems. And so even though there are transactions costs, as we showed by kind of the persistence of these systems over time. One potential extension that I guess I'm working on, one of them is the instrumental variables approach. I have some different instruments, but it takes a lot of time to calculate these. I'm also working on a grid. This is probably the most complicated to calculate, but the idea is to say that, and I'll show you a graph of it. The idea is that you have the area on the right, the black lines represent hypothetical parcels that have been created. The lines on the left is an example of the parcel using the Artment System versus the rectangular system. And so you can see that in the Armpit System on the left, grid square A is part of parcels that have river access, whereas the parcel B on the other side of the river is equidistant from the river. However, it does not have waterfront access, and so it doesn't have irrigation. It's not as easy to irrigate. It's not as easy for transportation unless you can get access through your neighbor's properties. Whereas for C and D, there really shouldn't be as big a difference for those because they, they're both adjacent to the river here. And so, what I'm hoping to test with this is if the Artment System has a significant benefit basically for parcel A, and if the rectangular system has a diminished benefit for parcel B, but that remains to be seen. So that's what I'm working on next. and that's what crashed it at 10:08 this morning. So in conclusion, Louisiana has very rugged terrain, similar to what Liebeck and Luke found for rugged terrain, right? Not for flat terrain, but for rugged terrain. There may not be as many benefits of using a rectangular survey system in Louisiana. This is consistent with the original reason why Congress allowed the Arpent system to continue with Louisiana in the early 1800s. And it shows that there is a persistence of parcel shapes over time. The initial allocations matter insofar as they do continue to have lingering effects on how parcels are shaped today, but they may not necessarily matter for efficiency if they were allocated well to begin with. So that concludes my prepared remarks. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Start it off.
Yes.
So, sorry to have come in late. I think the question might look really lousy if you had already addressed this while I was gone. So my understanding of the Artment System, right, is that riverfront property was really important, right? You needed to have access to the river to get your crops to the market from the farm. And so that was really expensive land, but inland land, not riverfront land, but like farther away, that was just farmland. So you needed to economize on the expensive land, at least get yourself some access to the river, and then as much plowable land as possible. And so that lends itself to this long rectangular plot of land. Much like in Amsterdam, everyone wants to be on a canal, and so those houses are super duper narrow, but they go all the way back. So this kind of goes to the endogeneity issue, is that since riverfront access is really valuable, river access is valuable, and since you would naturally opt for an Arpent system around rivers, the just seeing Arpent land be valuable doesn't reflect the Arpentness necessarily, just reflects the fact that you're by a river, and rivers are cool. They help you make money as a farmer.
Right.
So that was my initial reaction. Then I noticed you had some regression there where you actually control for riverfront access.
Yes.
And that it's still significantly positive. This was like line maybe 3 or 4, something like that.
Right.
Yeah. So if you're looking at column 3 there, the Armpit indicator is actually higher and it's significant, even if you're controlling for a navigable waterway and distance to the nearest waterway. Why do you think that would be the case then? That even if you've controlled away for waterfront access, Arpent lands would still sell for more?
I think that's a good question. I think it could be that today people are primarily taking their goods to market on highways. One of the things I'd like to do, I mean, it's been very hard to get data for this, is go back to land sales from maybe 100 years ago, before Huey Long paved all the roads and everything in Louisiana, and see if prior to the highway transportation system, if that riverfront access was more important, and there might be more of an effect then.
Right. Or pre-post.
Right.
Thanks.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
I have 2 comments and a criticism and a question. The first comment is, Ed was in my class in intermediate micro. He always dressed roughly that way, even when he was a kid. And I always dressed this way, and everyone thought he was the professor and I was the student. The second comment is, I run a seminar tomorrow afternoon at 4:45, the Human Action Seminar, and we're going over Mises's theory and history. Everybody is invited, and we have a free dinner afterward. It's in room 324 upstairs. The criticism is, I think you spelled Kosian wrong.
I may have.
You spell it Coasian, but his name is Coase. So I think it should be Cosen. I'm not sure about that.
No dissertation to you.
Yeah, let's fix that, right? That's embarrassing.
I'm not sure, but it might be misspelled. There it is. Shouldn't that be? That's it.
No squiggle, so I think you're right.
I think that's right, but I'm not sure. Now for my question, how does free enterprise fit into this? Like you gave the perspective of the central planner and how the central plan would work it. One of my books is on private roads. You know, we should have all private roads and highways. And there was that thing where somebody owned some land and then somebody owned land all around him, and then the question is, well, how does he get out or how does he get in? So does free enterprise or economic freedom fit into your dissertation at all, and if so?
I think so, absolutely. I think that one of the most significant players in the real estate market is going to be the real estate developers. And in many cases, they buy unsubdivided land that's large rural tracts, and in fact, so much so that I think in many areas that the kind of option value of land for development is even more valuable than its current use as farmland or timberland. It's a hugely important factor. And so how they choose to divide up the land for the people who are going to buy the land, it's not just something that the government would need to do. They're trying to figure out, do we want the parcels to be shaped like this or like that? I think it could also be relevant in any situation where a private developer is going to be taking one large resource and then reselling it. So I think it can have implications for any number of areas. Yes, Dr.
I'm curious, because of the way I grew up with movies and all, the Sooners,
Yeah.
one thinks of the mad dash when they blow the whistle or whatever. I'm wondering about, how they were able to parcel off stuff like that. In other words, if the government said, these are the land, the way we survey the land and say squares, I guess, would be out there in Oklahoma, huh? Well, what about people who came out and staked out claims that didn't fit the square?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that each county had a land office, and so, for example, the instrument I'm using, the Greensburg Land Office in St. Helena Parish. That's I think it's the parish seat of St. Helena Parish. And so, I don't know the answer to your question. It's an interesting question, but I would think that if they could define their claim, they could choose to use the landmarks that were there and say, I'm taking the northwest quad of this quadrant of this section. Or if they said, here's my survey, I've done it, they pay the fee and have it, filed with the land office. And I'm guessing that that's what they did. But I don't know how it would have worked in Oklahoma specifically.
And the thing that made me think about that was that always, as you point out, the natural features will lend value in some cases. So there were water, rivers going through there. You got the square grid. I want to go get that. It seems like maybe the Artment System might have been more, led to a more valuable way of dividing up the land. Hey, we'll all go get by the water.
Right. In situations like that, where I think that must have been what originally happened in the French settled areas, because it was people getting there. There was no U.S. government at that time, and they did just kind of endogenously decide to do it that way. I don't know how much top-down effort there was to impose the Armpit System. I think that could be similar. You're kind of referring to it like kind of bottom-up, people choosing to settle in this way in this area.
Well, the only reason I say that is all the cowboy movies I watched when I was a little kid. The Sooners would go out there first, right? Stake out the areas that they wanted, and then some kind of way cheat and get out there first. But it would always be the prime land that they had staked off, and then here come the honest people, and the crooks have already gone out there.
Yeah.
The homesteaders have gotten there first, Walter, and they've staked out, and all the good land's gone, to the crooks.
Right. Yeah. That definitely. I mean, there was a lot of corruption, and even the Virginia Military District. I think I think I read like a letter to Congress from like state representatives of Ohio or some group who was saying, we're concerned that there's a lot of obnoxious persons who styled themselves the such and such land company who are doing all these things, and it's all fraudulent. And in a lot of cases, the whole point of this land was it was supposed to be for veterans of the colonial wars to claim their own little farm. It was kind of this 40 acres in a farm or mule type of situation. But a lot of times, the veteran is like, I don't want to go out to Ohio. I just want my money. So they had people who were, I guess, right next door who would just buy your plot of land. I've seen a signature from one. I so and so assign my my piece of land to this person who amassed these massive tracts of land. It's kind of like someone buying people's food stamp cards or something like that. Because I don't think it was legal in that case.
Let me observe that Rothbard in the fifth volume of Conceived in Liberty suggests that the government restricted or required a minimum purchase, I think, of 640 acres in order to further the interest of the land speculators to prevent small landowners from going in and individually taking parcels. And instead it favored the class of people who got the law passed in the first place to divide it into squares.
But I don't think that applied to Oklahoma, which was supposed to be, this is the little
much
guy
later.
go out and grab your 40
100 years later, yeah.
Yeah, I think it was 40 acres or something.
Well, in the movies, what they do is they get in their horse or their wagon, and they see it. This is a movie. They see how big a circle they can ride in one day, and that's how much land they. I don't have any clue if that's what really happened. I've seen it in the movies, so
That must be
true.
But can you explain again the extension with the left-hand side and the right-hand side? It was one of your last slides. Could you explain what that next thing is you're going to do?
Oh, yeah. Let me just go ahead and go back to it. Yeah. So you're talking about the grid extension. Yeah, so basically the way this works is the kind of orange rectangle, the green rectangle, those are just like, 2 to 4 of the squares that will be part of a grid that will cover the whole state. So what I've been doing, I have to have this like loop that goes through like these sections of each parish. But so what you can do is create a grid, a polygon grid in the GIS program, and then for each square, instead of using parcels as the unit of analysis, say for each square, what is the soil quality? What is the elevation?
So it's a fraction of this parcel, it's a fraction of that parcel. So you'll basically create a synthetic new variable and then redo all of your analysis on hypothetical plots rather than the historical plots.
Yes.
So you're averaging over the endogeneity problem.
Yes. That is at least the endogeneity of how the treatment units were formed to begin with. It still could be, the actual treatment status itself is still endogenous because Congress chose to, this area is going to be rectangular, this area is going to be arctic. But at least, the treatment unit is not endogenous. Yes?
Can you clarify a little bit more kind of the role of government in terms of the different types of land parcels that are given out and whether or not, because it seemed at one point you were talking about like how the social planner using one of the grid type of systems, even though they would have higher transaction costs, this might be a little bit of a benefit. Is it possible for there to be people kind of coming at it like in like the Wild West type of days without any type of government going in to parcel out the lands, or would that be problematic and the government would be needing to kind of parcel out these lands in this type of way?
I think in answer to your question, I think the parts of the U.S. were settled in the way that you described, the kind of Wild West method. Specifically the Felicianas, the Florida parishes, people were free to put stakes down and claim whatever they wanted. In fact, I think Georgia had a lot of that. The West, it's an interesting question because I don't know as much about the history of the West. It's all subject to the Learned Public Land Survey system. I wonder if what was happening, and someone maybe has better historical knowledge than I could maybe comment as to this, but there were a lot of areas that were public rangelands. I don't know how much people were, it may have been in some cases that people were farming on public lands or they were grazing on public lands. And so they didn't even necessarily own the land that they were on. I think for homestead, to get a homestead, you had to farm it for a certain length of time before it even became yours. In fact, I found in the course of this project, my great-great-grandmother, her name was in the paper, Sophia Hemstrom is claiming her land. She's been here, and anyone who disagrees has to object to it within the next couple of days. And so I think in her case, the ultimate land parcel that she got was actually a rectangular shaped parcel. So the role of the government, I think, depends on how much planning they want to do, and it depends on if people are actually claiming the land for their own, or if they're just using it for grazing or what have you. But I don't know if I've answered your question.
To clarify a little bit further, if you have a situation where rather than maybe the Armpit system, kind of a little bit more of a grid type of a system would be a little bit better, would it be necessary for the state or the government to come in and implement that type of a process, or kind of give them like almost a coaching type of thing, if this is a preferable situation? Even if they're kind of doing something a little bit different, we're going to kind of gravitate towards this, or is there a place where the government can facilitate that process a little bit further?
I think if one system is, if they clearly prefer one system to another, they either need to, they either would need to sell it to a private developer who would determine it. I mean, you could do it still in a private manner, but it could help to have someone impose that grid. Either the government does it or the developer does it, because otherwise you wind up with, as I mentioned one slide, you can have the overlapping, grids, and so there's this collision between systems, or you could have a situation where there's little slivers of land that no one wants, and it might be more land than either of the neighboring parcels owners want to own. And so I still think that, I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be the government, but some kind of coordination can help to prevent those collisions and slivers and ambiguities that don't exist otherwise. Yes?
Yeah, so based on your research, if you were American government back in the 1800s, how would you go about the land reform? What would be your approach?
Well, that's a good question. I think I think that the rectangular system provided a lot of benefits over the meets and bounds system that had been in place. I think that the problems with it, there were a lot of problems in Georgia that, like I said, with claims that were ambiguously defined or fraudulent, people moving boundaries. Ultimately, in Ohio, they had a lot of disputes, litigation relating to meets and bounds parcels, more so than for the rectangular parcels. And so the rectangular system, I mean, perhaps finding some way to modify the rectangular system in areas where rugged terrain is encountered to accommodate things like streams. Those are, I think, the biggest weaknesses that you can observe with the rectangular system. Because presumably, if the property rights were more secure, better defined under the rectangular system, then there is that benefit. The only downside to it is the fact that when you run into hills, streams, creeks, rivers, etc., you have this negative. If there's some way to ameliorate the negative while still retaining the benefit, that would probably be one of the few things that they could have done better, based on my observation.
In my experience, in Louisiana at least, where we have forced airship as opposed to primogeniture, the square system tends to break down into a Artment system, if you will, because when a piece of land is subdivided on a road, it might be a square originally. You have 4 heirs. They're not gonna make 4 squares out of it. They're gonna divide it whichever direction. They're gonna divide it into long, skinny pieces with frontage on the road. I've seen that happen many times. I don't think I've ever seen a larger square parcel be subdivided into smaller square parcels and the death of the owner.
That's an interesting observation. In fact, I know in my neighborhood in Baton Rouge, I remember seeing there was one house when I first moved in there that, if you looked at it from behind, the roof was caved in, and I was talking to someone about it. I said, "Oh yeah, there's 128 heirs to that house. I mean, you can't have."
Well, the problem is access. The real problem that drives us, just like the Armpit System on a water body, is access to the street. And there's servitudes and things that give people access to a landlocked but that's not nearly as beneficial to the owner as actual frontage on the street that they do. Obviously, frontage is much more valuable on any sort of access, not just on waterways. So I just seen the squares break down into slivers over and over again.
Yeah, it's interesting how the legal system interacts with this. It's very interesting. Is Dr. Moore?
I'm a little curious, I'd like to ask you to speculate on something, but when we think about the West in the United States, we know that the federal government owns, I don't say it's not 100%, but a huge percentage of the land west of the Mississippi. And then you go back and you say, well, they had the land grants for the railroads. And I'm wondering if you think that those land grants for the railroads, the corruption it is more facilitated by the fact that they use the square system out there than if they had used the Artment System, because obviously the land along the railroads out there had the same increased value as lands along rivers with the Artment System.
And do you think that it would have led
Well, I don't
to
know.
decreased corruption?
We know there was corruption involved in that. I mean, that's been so well documented.
Right.
But the question is, would having an Armpit system increase the corruption or lessen the corruption? I'm just,
I would think so, because when I talked to the assessors, at least deputy assessors about the Armpit system, one of their complaints is that a lot of times the way it works is they say, well, it's 5 armpits down from this person's farm, and then the next one is 5 armpits down from this one. So you can see very easily how, if you just have someone who's looking at these one at a time, you could wind up with 30 armpits wide worth of land in 10 armpits worth of actual space. So I would think that whereas the rectangular system, there's only 36 townships in a particular 36 sections in a particular township range. So I would think that it would be, it wouldn't require as much kind of serial calculations to detect over-subscribing, if you will. So I think if anything, the rectangular system might have less corruption. But do you think that would be otherwise? Or?
I don't know. I was looking at the river and I said, hey, they put railroads out and they were, quote, giving the land away, which they obviously weren't giving it away, but the land grants, and saying that was certainly open to corruption.
Right.
But the every other square, the checkerboard approach to giving the land away for the railroads, how that would have changed the situation if they could have given Armpit type grants.
Oh, I see. So you're thinking like they could, instead of giving as much land to the growers, they could have given only the land that bordered the railroad, basically?
Yeah.
I see. That's interesting. Yeah, that's an interesting thought, because if you're dealing with a situation where something is near something else, it's a lot easier to like, oh, well, we'll just, slightly increase that, we'll give you the whole thing. If it would have decreased, maybe it would have made it easier to tailor the land grants to the parcels that are more nearly adjacent to the railroads themselves. Is that kind of what you're saying?
Yeah. I would tell them, I won't give you all this land. I said, we're not giving all this land away. We're just giving a little bit of land to the railroad. But it's the Armpit land that's valuable.
Right. Interesting. Dr.
If I had to summarize your attitude toward Kosa, it would be very positive. My attitude toward Kosa is he's a commie. Worse than the commies. At least the commies had a property rights system. His system violates all property rights.
Right.
Take Sturgis versus Bridgman. The case that you first started with. If the relative prices of the confectionery and the doctor are such, they award it to the doctor. If the relative prices are the other way, they award it to the machinist. But relative prices keep changing. So every day you could have a new case. Like if you and I are having a dispute and I win today, you can bring me to court tomorrow and win, and the next day I come back and take the stuff from you. So this is sort of an abnegation of property rights. And the idea that you should award people the stuff based on what will maximize the GDP is horrendous. I mean, I had a full head of hair before I read codes. Look at me now.
I remember you described talking to him once, yeah. I think that's a good point that what's important is for the property rights, once they're defined, to be